So I think there's a theme emerging, Norm, but I'm going to continue to dunk on beef in this particular conference panel. So just to start off, so I'm representing Impossible Foods. We're a food tech company based up in Redwood City. It's very close to San Francisco. Quick show of hands, who has heard of us? We're a pretty small company. Oh, that's great. Has anyone had the product? Wow, this is a lot more than usual in most of the audiences. But, wait, where's the clicker? Here we go. So like I said, we are a food tech company. We're in Redwood City. We were founded in 2011. Our product, flagship product, the Impossible Burger, has been on the market since 2016. We've expanded a lot, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what the company is, why it was founded, and how this all connects to this idea of climate and scaling nutrition and doing so in a way that doesn't exceed planetary thresholds. So throughout this, I want to continue to emphasize that we see ourselves as a tool in a toolkit, something that we've talked a lot about here at this conference, many little hammers all coming together for the same goal. We're just at the other end of the value chain. So moving all the way from production through consumer, and consumer is really where our focus is. All right, well, we know where we are. I want to just give a little quick background on me to contextualize some of this. I do not have any particular problem with beef. I don't think anyone at our company does. I actually kind of like cattle. I grew up on a cow-calf operation in western Wisconsin. I came to Impossible Foods literally from a grass-fed ranch. There's a research facility owned by Cal Poly, that's who I worked for, in Santa Cruz County, and it produces grass-fed beef among other organic crops. And so I've worked on the production side, I've done work in the Middle East and in ecosystem services, and so when I came to Impossible Foods, it wasn't with this idea of let's take down livestock, it was really this idea of how do we expand the conversation from that production side, from the focus on yield gaps into something that is also empowering consumers to have more of a vote in sustainability, in helping people get a tool to actually achieve some of these plant-based transitions. And I'm going to focus on this idea of uncompromising. So it's really hard to get people to actually switch over to a plant-based diet. Meat is delicious. I'm kind of our target market. I eat meat. I'm married to a Brazilian. I have a lot of opportunities for barbecues. It's really hard to say no to a steak or to a burger. Until recently, and there's a number of others in our space, but there haven't been a lot of good alternatives. So I'm someone who cares deeply about sustainability. It's literally my job. And if I'm going to one of these said barbecues, I will try to get there efficiently. I live in San Francisco. I will take BART. I will get in a Prius. I will carpool. I'll maybe bike if I feel like taking my life into my own hands. But I will not, when I get to the actual barbecue, I will not substitute burger for tofu. I won't. And so that's the idea here, is getting an actual tool into consumers' hands. So we're all kind of eating like great white sharks. I don't have to explain this a lot because I think there's been a lot of the context already presented through the folks on these different panels. Sorry, this is kind of zooming around a little bit. But like we've already talked about, this is great because I don't have to rehash a lot of it, but food waste reductions are incredibly important, both for nutrition and for averting some of these methane-based GHGs and the upstream impacts of it. Yield improvements, closing yield gaps, achieving genetic potential, also hugely important. It can be accomplished through breeding, use of CRISPR, integrated pest management, just extension of pest management practices, which UCCE is extremely important in. You can improve distribution. You can have better cold chains to get food where it's needed badly and reduce food waste along those chains. What we haven't had so far, and that there's an ongoing development of, not just through Impossible Foods, but is what I'm going to call a carnivore transition assistance program, something where you don't have to compromise when you trade off, something where you actually want to eat it instead of going, I guess I'll do this for the planet, fine. This is a really simplified graph, and there have been much better graphs earlier today, but basically it's just a really rough estimate. This is from I want to say it's the 2012 Alexandrados paper from the FAO. But looking at a basic idea of food system scaling, beef is supposed to increase by 2050, consumption of beef by about 88% over what it currently is. We've already seen that the impact of beef is an order of magnitude above that of other protein forms. And so if we're looking at where we are right now, livestock farming very, very broadly is generating emissions equivalent roughly to the entire global transportation industry. There's a lot of focus on our energy sector, on the cars that we manufacture, on batteries for vehicles, but there's not that much attention that we've been placing historically on changing the way that we eat to something that's more plant-based. And until recently, that was really hard to do because it wasn't perceived as something where it was feasible. Luckily, it seems very much like that's changing, but it also is responsible for 1/4 to 1/3, animal farming, of all water use. That includes water that's falling on feed crops like pastures, corn, soy. And it's about half of land. And when I say half of, I mean, and this is a number that comes from the International Livestock Research Institute, that includes these mixed use or other landscapes where you have woody savannas that have intermittent or low density grazing occurring on them. It's a huge missed opportunity for carbon sequestration, but it's something that's often very critical for food security. So if we're here right now, if this is where we are with 2018, 2019, really maxed out on planetary thresholds, partially in result of livestock farming and the way we eat, what does that look like in 2050? A little bit apocalyptic based on some of these earlier projections, but there are ways that we can help mitigate. And among them are the things that Impossible Foods is trying to provide. So some of you might actually know this guy. He's our CEO and founder, Dr. Pat Brown. He had no intention of starting a food company. He was a biochemist at Stanford. He had his own lab. His job was to discover things, invent things, and he's fundamentally a problem solver. So he was part of the cohort that developed the microarray for understanding genomic expression. He was part of the cohort that came up with the Public Library of Science and made academic literature more accessible to audiences that don't have the ability to go through a paywall. And in the spirit of problem solving, he is a longtime vegan, and he was thinking about ways to address big climate issues, the spectacular loss of biodiversity over the past several decades, and what he landed on was, well, livestock is crazy. So how do we think about that from a policy perspective? He assembled a conference, he got a bunch of scientists and researchers and policymakers together, and he was like, this is it, we're gonna finally shed some light on this. And somewhat predictably, that didn't go anywhere. There was no outcomes based on the white paper they generated in terms of actual what happened with consumer behavior or what he saw as policy in California. And so he was like, all right, fine, I'm gonna start a company and I'm gonna make plant-based food. And I think that this is the way that we're gonna do it, through developing a functional equivalent for plant-based food. The idea is pretty simple. We've already seen this before. It's a cliche in Silicon Valley, but it's the concept of back in, however many hundreds of years ago, London, we had a lot of horses. And the horses were getting us from place to place. It was very important. We've used these things for very, very long time, but there were so many of them. They were piling up manure in the streets. Everyone was getting gross. It was an epidemiological problem that largely became abated, or was abated, when Henry Ford was like, hey, this will be fun and fast and more efficient, and I can make them cool. So the car helped us solve that problem. Now we have so many cars, it's a whole different problem regarding fossil fuel use. You can now get something like a Tesla if you have $1 million. You can get a Prius. You can find other options like a Chevy Volt. And so can we apply the same logic to livestock? Can we go from something that we've used for thousands of years and it's worked great, until now when we just happen to have a lot of them? 1.3 to 1.5 billion cows on the planet right now. And so that's what the company was trying to develop some alternatives for. Again, in a space that's really growing. There's a number of different companies that are working on similar things and collaborating really closely with researchers. Oh, and this is the product. That's the the Impossible Burger in its burger incarnation. The nice thing about this is that it is versatile. We set out with the intent of making sure that this is something that can be available in all applications of ground beef. All types of food culture can use it because you can make meatballs, bolognese sauce. It really comes like a ground beef product. And it's made entirely from plants, which is why we can be very sustainable relative to beef. There's 4 main ingredients, and please ignore the wheat picture on here. We haven't updated our slides yet, but we have a new formulation or new recipe. It's called Impossible 2.0, and that just came out. Actually, Mani's Good Burger over here is one of the first places that has it, but it includes soy protein. It's better protein quality, quite frankly, as well as potato protein, coconut oil, and some sunflower oil now. And heme, leg hemoglobin. I'm going to get to that in a second, but you can think about it like a plant-based analog for the myoglobin in your bloodstream. It's important to how beef cooks, and all meat, actually. But the way that Pat really started this company was by going to venture capitalists and saying, you can make money on this. And that was very important. It's a $1.7 trillion animal farming industry now. By 2030, that's expected to go up to about $3 trillion, which is pretty compelling when you're trying to ask people to give you money for something where you want to save the planet. And so there's a lot of paths for growth in the animal farming sector, or rather, I should say the meat and dairy sector, because it's really hard to visualize a pathway for the growth of that industry when it's already exceeding planetary thresholds for livability. And to me, plant-based meat and dairy products are one of the only ways that we can continue to scale that industry, specifically on the food end of it, meat and dairy products, without really having a lot of problems, without hitting our own ceiling in terms of what we can grow and still meet the nutritional needs of the planet. So in that spirit, when we were founded in 2011, had a big R&D team early on, and they spent 5 years figuring out, reverse engineering, meat. Why does it taste the way that it does, specifically beef? Why does it cook the way it does? Why does it change color when you grill it? What's driving the Maillard reaction? And what they landed on, and this was an early hypothesis, was that blood is very important to catalyze all of this. And so are fatty acids, amino acids, and vitamins. There's lots of precursors when you're cooking meat that make it change in the way that it does and make it so palatable. But heme was very important in this, small iron-carrying molecule, and so we were sourcing that from leg hemoglobin. It's originally found in the root nodules of soybeans, really anything that fixes its own nitrogen, and it's the leg hemoglobin protein, very analogous to myoglobin. So we found a way to get that really critical ingredient from plants. Now, there is a ton of lab work that happens. There's a lot of R&D that goes into this. We have a really amazing group of scientists. But at the end of the day, when we're actually manufacturing this thing, and we produce everything right now in Oakland, California, it's plant proteins that we squish together in a paddle mixer. So it's fairly low tech in terms of how we actually make it. And this is, you can see right here, the production line in Oakland itself. And so the capacity there is like 1 million pounds of burger per month, but that's still just a teeny, tiny fraction of what the total beef market is. And this is intended to be a technology platform that can be expanded way beyond ground beef. We have a number of prototypes in the lab. We're focusing on commercialization of beef products, in large part because of the climate impacts. Our next product is going to be steak. You really have to kind of hit multiple parts of a cow before you can expect any level of actual on-the-ground impact or changes in herd size, and it wouldn't just be us, clearly. But it should be pretty broadly applicable to our future product pipeline. Significantly more sustainable than the alternative products coming from cows. I have to start with a caveat. These are the LCA numbers for our last formulation, our last recipe. They're very, very similar for our current 2.0 recipe. They're in the process of being vetted by a panel for ISO compliance, and we'll have those out probably in the next month. But because you're going directly to the plant, you're not going through an animal conversion process, it's much, much more resource efficient. And part of that is because, well, all of that reason is because, especially with beef, cows live a long time, Beef cattle tend to live for 1.5 years. They're very gassy, they're emitting a lot of methane, and they just consume a tremendous amount of feed. And so the metabolic upkeep of these animals is what leads it to be so resource intensive. Like I said, I'm married to a Brazilian. This is a photo that I took in the Mato Grosso of Brazil. When we're road tripping there, it is a guarantee of two things. First, that I will pull over the car and take pictures. Second, that I will rant. So this is deforestation from pasture in that region, and this is not a Brazil problem. It's not a US problem. It's a global problem. I don't want to cast stones. This is just because people want meat, because meat is good. But how do you scale this up in a way that doesn't bankrupt our natural resources, that doesn't cause more devastation to the Amazon? That's where production technology has to meet consumer solutions. I'm not going to go too much farther into this because we've already seen very similar numbers, but some animal products are a little better than others when it comes to efficiency. Eggs are, in the scheme of things, pretty good. Cows are Cows are just not that good at converting plant material into things that you eat. So for every 100 grams of protein that they consume in plant form, throughout the entire distribution chain, about 3 of those grams wind up on your plate as a consumer. In our case, it's really important as we scale, as the industry itself of plant-based and alternative-based proteins grow, that industry is capturing actual carnivores. If you're just getting vegetarians and vegans, number one, it's not good for your market size. Number two, it doesn't translate to any impact. In the case of vegans, you might be going in the opposite direction because this is more impactful than soy. And in our case, we do have the vast majority of consumers who identify as omnivores or carnivores in some way. 75% is pretty good, especially compared to other plant-based burgers. But I have a suspicion that as our price drops, because we are priced premium right now, this number should rise. People shopping for food select food generally based on a very short list of criteria, and that is taste, what's the quality, price, what does it cost me, and availability, where can I get it, and is it easy to get? Somewhere down here, you will find sustainability for most people. And so that's why this is our communications team, really. We lead our messaging and our marketing with delicious, even though it is a very sustainable alternative to what we're trying to displace. The reason for that, we know that it's not necessarily possible to get people bought in just on the environmental story. And this is a way to put the tool into consumers' hands, and consumers, I don't care if consumers care about what the product is intended to do, that it's intended as a climate mitigation tool. That's kind of the beauty of the approach. So, and this is a really salesy slide, but I'm only showing it to also demonstrate that it's tough to get a new product, much like cricket powder, much like these other things, socialized for consumers. What the heck is plant-based meat? Why should I be eating this? Is it even good? It's really tough to get people to shift from established patterns, especially when there's something that's really good that you're trying to displace. And so the way that we tried to address that was by first selling in and developing with these launch partners who have Michelin stars, who have extremely expensive restaurants, very candidly. And then from there, that's intended to build credibility, to show people that it's actually good. If you eat meat, you might like this. From there, getting as far down the chain as humanly possible. So like I said, I'm from the Midwest. We're available in every White Castle nationally right now, which was a very big deal for me and my family. And we're in a number of these other different places. We're distributing through main distribution channels. We're in over 5,000 restaurants. And again, that scale, the actual business impact translates to, in theory, environmental impact over time as the industry matures. Also, based on, to a large extent, climate reasons, we chose to launch in Hong Kong and Macau. We're trying to penetrate an Asian market to some extent. Part of that is because the greatest growth in demand is coming from China. You have these emerging economies. And it's important that you can find ways to scale that system to avoid the virtual resource flows, the virtual water flows and carbon flows associated with sourcing meat, mostly out of Latin America. What's a new solution? Again, what's part of the toolkit that we can use? This is a paper that we did with Denmark Technical University. There's a postdoc who wanted to figure out, okay, well, what could ground beef displacement what would that look like at a national scale? Am I doing okay on time? Great. And so using the LCA, using dietary modeling for kind of reference baselines, what does a healthy diet look like, and then how can you substitute plant-based meat? If you were to displace 50% of total ground beef, just ground beef, consumption in the US, again, assuming that there was an environmental impact there, it would be about equivalent to 1 to 2 times the size of Nevada in land use bearing, upwards of 50 million fewer annual US water consumers, and about 5 to 10 million average US drivers removed in terms of the actual GHGs. Again, and I know that there's a lot of nuance here, this assumes that there are co-products that are being addressed. You make a lot of things out of a cow. You make steak, you make tri-tip, you make leather, you get ground beef, and so what's really important is that when this industry matures, we are focusing on these things, including milk. That's a big co-product of cattle, especially in the rest of the world, where they don't have a segregated beef and dairy herd. And if I had to really summarize what the intent of the company is and what the intent of the industry is over a very long time period, less of this guy, using more plants so that there's more room for things like the awesome animals that are found in the Amazon, so that we're not extensifying the animal agriculture footprint, and so that you can feed a lot more people using those resources that would otherwise go into feeding livestock and losing everything through a conversion. Thank you.